Juliet Harris sat by the airplane window, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The faint hum of the engines a backdrop to her thoughts. She wasn't nervous. Not exactly. Flying was never her favorite activity. But she had long since learned to handle discomfort with quiet patience. At 45, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed unshakable, a result of years spent navigating a world that wasn't always kind. Her white blouse, patterned with delicate blue flowers, and her neatly pressed black skirt reflected the care she took in presenting herself to the world. Even when the world didn't always offer her the same courtesy. Beside her, Alan, her boss, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A tall, wiry man in his early 40s. He looked even thinner in the ill-fitting navy suit he always wore on work trips. Alan was a good man, if a bit blunt, and Juliet had learned to appreciate his honesty over the years. He was deeply engrossed in his tablet, scrolling through a work document, leaving Juliet to her thoughts. The emergency exit row was a choice Juliet made for practicality. The extra legroom provided a small measure of relief on long flights. Though the proximity to the exit always unsettled her, she wasn't afraid of emergencies. Not exactly, but the idea of being called upon in a crisis carried a certain weight. The sound of brisk footsteps in the aisle pulled her from her thoughts. A flight attendant approached, her sharp features framed by a perfectly tied orange scarf. Her name tag read Clara. Something about the way she moved decisive, purposeful gave Juliet the sense that Clara wasn't one for small talk or pleasantries. When Clara stopped by their row, Juliet looked up, offering a polite smile. She didn't expect the words that followed. "You'll need to move," Clara said, her voice crisp and firm. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Her tone carried an edge that turned heads, drawing glances from nearby passengers. Juliet blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm, though her chest tightened. "You're in the emergency exit row," Clara replied, her gaze steady but devoid of warmth. "You're too large to sit here." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in altitude. For a moment, Juliet didn't respond. She couldn't. The accusation was so unexpected, so startling, that her mind struggled to process it. She glanced down at herself, at the slim lines of her black skirt, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Large? She wasn't small, but she had never thought of herself as someone who would draw such a comment. I'm sorry," Juliet stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "No excuses," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp enough to slice through Juliet's confusion. "This row is for passengers who meet the requirements. I'll find you another seat." The air around them thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. Juliet glanced at Alan, hoping for support, but he looked away, his face clouded with discomfort. He wasn't the type to intervene. And today was no exception. Juliet stood, her movements slow, deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their curiosity and unease pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy weight. Clara stepped aside, motioning brusquely for Juliet to follow her down the aisle. The walk to her new seat felt endless, each step a reminder of the humiliation she couldn't escape. When Juliet sat down, away from the emergency exit row, she stared out the window, her reflection faint against the blue sky beyond. She had never considered herself fragile, but the sting of Clara's words lingered, settling somewhere deep in her chest. She clenched her hands together, her knuckles white, and focused on her breathing. In and out, steady, composed. It was the only way she knew how to handle moments like this. Alan's voice broke the silence. "That was uncalled for," he said, his words hesitant, as though testing the weight of them. "It's fine," Juliet replied, though the tightness in her throat betrayed her. "It's just embarrassing." The words were small, but they carried the weight of something larger, something unspoken. Juliet knew this wasn't about seat assignments or safety protocols. It was about something deeper, something she had encountered countless times before in quieter, more insidious forms. Today, it had chosen to reveal itself through Clara, her sharp words cutting deeper than they had any right to. As the plane ascended, Juliet closed her eyes, willing herself to let the moment pass. But deep down, She knew this was a wound that wouldn't heal easily. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about how the world saw her and how, no matter how composed or prepared she was, she couldn't always control the narrative that others wrote for her. Juliet sat in her new seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, a serene expanse of blue dotted with soft clouds. Inside, the plane hummed steadily, carrying its passengers to their destinations, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Juliet's own mind, however, was far from peaceful. The scene in the emergency exit row played on a loop, each detail vivid, refusing to fade. She adjusted her blouse, as though smoothing out the fabric might somehow ease the sting of Clara's words. It didn't. Her chest still felt tight, her cheeks flushed with lingering embarrassment. She glanced around the cabin, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers. Were they still looking at her? Did they see her as Clara had? As someone out of place? Alan remained silent beside her, absorbed in his tablet. He hadn't said much since they had been moved, and Juliet didn't expect him to. Alan was a man of pragmatism, not confrontation. Perhaps he thought silence was the kindest course. Perhaps he simply didn't know what to say. Juliet's eyes drifted to the flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, their movements brisk and practiced. Clara was among them, her posture rigid, her expression set in the neutral mask of someone accustomed to being observed. Juliet wondered if Clara even remembered what she had said. Did those words, so sharp and cutting, linger with her the way they lingered with Juliet? Or were they just part of another day's work, forgotten as soon as they were spoken? A quiet murmur of conversation floated through the cabin. Juliet caught fragments of words, phrases that blended into the low hum of the plane. Somewhere behind her, a child giggled. Nearby, a man was explaining something to his seatmate, his voice calm and steady. It was all so normal, so ordinary, yet for Juliet, the world felt tilted, as though the plane were flying just slightly off balance. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp pang of urgency in her stomach. She shifted in her seat, realizing with a small sense of dread that she needed to use the restroom. The discomfort had been building for some time, and now it could no longer be ignored. She hesitated, glancing at the aisle where Clara was walking with the same brisk determination she had shown earlier. Juliet leaned slightly toward Alan. "I think I need to use the restroom," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Do you think it's okay?" Alan glanced up from his tablet, his expression distracted. "The seatbelt sign is off." "I'm sure it's fine," he replied, already returning to his work. Gathering her courage, Juliet unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. She straightened her skirt, smoothing the fabric with a deliberate calm that belied her nervousness. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the aisle and made her way toward the restroom at the back of the plane. Clara was there, her orange scarf bright against the muted tones of the cabin. Juliet approached slowly, her steps measured. When Clara noticed her, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "What do you need?" Clara asked, her tone curt, her voice louder than necessary. Juliet swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'd like to use the restroom," she said, her voice steady but soft. Clara folded her arms, her expression unyielding. "The seatbelt sign is on," she replied sharply. "You'll have to wait." Juliet blinked, confused. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the seatbelt sign remained unlit. I thought it was off," she said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. Clara sighed, the sound heavy with irritation. "The captain will let you know when it's safe," she said, dismissing Juliet with a slight wave of her hand. "Return to your seat." The dismissal stung, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were delivered with a cold finality that left no room for discussion. Juliet turned, her cheeks flushing as she walked back to her seat. The aisle seemed longer now, the eyes of the passengers heavier. She slid into her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened her seatbelt. Alan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" "Nothing," Juliet replied quickly, her voice tight. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. The small injustice of it gnawed at her. The casual cruelty of being dismissed as though her needs didn't matter. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way. And she knew it wouldn't be the last. The world was full of moments like this. Small slights that piled up over time, forming an invisible weight that only those who carried it could feel. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, Juliet stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She had learned long ago how to endure moments like this. To stay quiet, to stay composed. But today, something inside her stirred, a quiet determination that refused to be silenced. This time, she thought, she wouldn't let it go. The plane hummed steadily as Juliet sat back in her seat, her hands resting loosely on her lap. She had always thought of herself as someone who could brush things off. Someone who didn't let the small indignities of life linger. But today, the weight of Clara's words, her dismissive tone, and the judgment that lay beneath them pressed heavily on Juliet's chest. It was a familiar feeling, one she had learned to name only in recent years, the quiet ache of being seen. Not as a person, but as something lesser. She glanced around the cabin, trying to center herself in the mundane. A man flipped through the pages of a paperback novel 2 rows ahead. Across the aisle, a woman softly whispered to her child, tucking a blanket over the small, sleepy form. Life moved on, as it always did, indifferent to the turmoil that churned inside her. And yet, Juliet couldn't let it go. Not this time. Her gaze shifted to Clara, who was making her way down the aisle with the same brisk efficiency. Her orange scarf a bright, almost defiant splash of color. Clara moved like she belonged. Like every inch of this space answered to her. Juliet wondered if Clara had ever thought about the weight of her words. Or if they came so easily to her that she never paused to consider the impact they might have. A quiet murmur from the row in front of her caught Juliet's attention. She hadn't been listening before, but now the tone of the conversation drew her in. A man, his voice low but clear, leaned slightly toward the woman beside him. "She's done this before," he murmured, "the last time we flew with her. She snapped at someone for asking for a second drink." The woman beside him nodded, her expression a mix of exasperation and resignation. "I know," she replied softly. "I've seen her be rude to so many people. It's like she's looking for someone to take her frustrations out on." Juliet's ears perked up. She leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. So it wasn't just her. Clara's sharpness, her dismissiveness, it wasn't personal. Juliet had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed by strangers offered a strange sort of comfort. This wasn't about Juliet as a person, it was about something much larger. Something that had little to do with her and everything to do with Clara's own anger. Her own struggles. The realization didn't erase the sting of what had happened, but it reframed it, for the first time since she had been forced to leave her seat. Juliet felt a small shift in perspective. Clara wasn't an immovable force, an unyielding authority. She was just a person, imperfect, flawed, and perhaps weighed down by her own burdens. Juliet sat with this thought for a moment, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. It would have been easy to grow angry, to let the bitterness of the moment consume her. But Juliet had learned long ago that anger, while powerful, often came at a cost. If she wanted to address this, she would have to do so with clarity and grace. Her eyes drifted toward the front of the plane, where another flight attendant stood near the galley. She was younger, with kind eyes and a gentle expression that set her apart from Clara's brusque demeanor. Juliet watched her for a moment, weighing her options. Taking a deep breath, Juliet unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as she made her way toward the young attendant. When she reached her, Juliet spoke softly, careful not to draw too much attention. "Excuse me," she began, her voice calm but steady. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The attendant turned, her kind eyes meeting Juliet's. "Of course," she replied, setting down the drink she had been preparing. "Is everything all right?" Juliet hesitated, only for a moment. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said, "but I've had a bit of an issue with one of the other attendants. Clara, she's been less than courteous. Not just to me, but to others as well. I thought you might want to be aware." The attendant's brows furrowed slightly, concern flickering across her face. "I'm so sorry to hear that," she said. "Can you tell me what happened?" Juliet recounted the events with quiet precision, leaving out the sharpest edges but not downplaying the facts. She explained the incident in the emergency exit row, the refusal to let her use the restroom, and the tone that had made it all so much worse. The attendant listened intently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When Juliet finished, the young woman placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll make sure this is addressed. You shouldn't have to feel this way." Juliet nodded, a small flicker of relief blooming in her chest. She returned to her seat. Her steps lighter now, her breathing steadier. She didn't know what would come of her conversation with the attendant. But she had done something. She had spoken up, not with anger or malice, but with the quiet strength that had carried her through so many moments like this before. As she sat down, Juliet noticed Clara walking down the aisle again, her expression slightly more tense than before. The change was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, Clara looked less like someone in control and more like someone unsure of her footing. Juliet leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the window. The sky outside was still endless, still serene, and for the first time that day, Juliet felt a small sense of calm settle within her. She had found her voice, and with it, the quiet power to reclaim a piece of herself. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, the hum of the engines steady and predictable. Juliet sat in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze unfocused. The weight of the earlier incidents still lingered, but now there was something else, a flicker of resolve. She didn't know exactly what would come of her conversation with the young flight attendant. But the act of speaking up had done something important. It had reminded her that she didn't have to carry the burden of silence. The young attendant passed by her row, offering a small, reassuring smile as she moved toward the galley. Juliet returned the gesture, a subtle acknowledgement that things were in motion, though she couldn't quite see where they would lead. Across the aisle, a man adjusted his tray table, his movements deliberate and unhurried. A woman behind him reached into her bag, retrieving a well-worn paperback. Life went on in the cabin, ordinary and unremarkable, but Juliet felt the tension beneath it all, the way passengers glanced at the crew, the way conversations quieted when Clara walked by. Clara herself moved through the aisles with her usual briskness. But something was different. Her steps seemed heavier, her expression tighter. Juliet watched her discreetly, noting the subtle change, the clenched jaw, a flicker of uncertainty when passengers addressed her. Clara was still performing her duties, but the air of authority that had defined her earlier had begun to waver. It wasn't just Juliet who noticed. The couple seated in front of her exchanged a glance as Clara passed, their expressions unreadable but knowing. Juliet leaned back slightly, her mind turning over the events of the past hour. Clara's behavior had been more than just personal, it had rippled outward, affecting everyone in small, almost imperceptible ways. The cabin was a microcosm, a reflection of the world beyond its pressurized walls, a world where unspoken prejudices and unchecked authority could create fractures in the most mundane of settings. Juliet's thoughts were interrupted when the young flight attendant returned, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She stopped by Juliet's row, leaning slightly toward her. "The captain is aware," she said quietly, her tone calm but firm. "You're welcome to use the restroom whenever you need. If you need anything else, please let me know." Juliet blinked, a wave of relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. The attendant nodded and moved on, her presence a quiet reassurance. Juliet stood, her movements deliberate, and made her way down the aisle. This time, she didn't hesitate. When she passed Clara, their eyes met briefly. Clara's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she said nothing. For the first time, Juliet felt the weight of the exchange shift. Clara's silence wasn't triumph, it was acknowledgement. A subtle admission that the balance of power had shifted, however slightly. In the small, cramped restroom, Juliet stared at her reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at her was calm, composed. She adjusted her blouse, smoothing the fabric over her shoulders, and took a deep breath. This was a small victory, but it was hers. She had reclaimed something intangible, her dignity, her sense of agency. When she returned to her seat, Juliet noticed another change. Clara had been replaced in her section by a different flight attendant. A woman with a warm smile and an air of quiet professionalism. This new attendant approached Juliet almost immediately. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked. Her tone genuinely kind. "No, thank you," Juliet replied, her voice steady. "I'm fine." The flight continued, the moments slipping by with a quiet predictability that Juliet welcomed. She leaned back in her seat, allowing herself to relax for the first time since the plane had taken off. The tension that had gripped her chest eased, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. Alan glanced at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "You all right?" he asked, his tone hesitant but sincere. Juliet nodded. "I am," she said simply. And she was. This wasn't the first time she had encountered someone like Clara, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, she had chosen to act not out of anger, but out of a quiet determination to assert her humanity in the face of someone who had tried to diminish it. It was a small act, perhaps, but it mattered. It always mattered. As the plane continued its journey, Juliet looked out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of blue and white. She thought about the people around her, the way they had watched, listened, and, in their own quiet ways, understood. The cabin wasn't just a space filled with strangers, it was a reflection of a larger world. A world that could change, one small act at a time. Juliet sat quietly in her seat, the soft hum of the plane now a familiar background to her thoughts. The earlier tension in the cabin had settled into a kind of uneasy calm, like a storm that had passed but left the air thick and heavy. She traced the edge of her armrest with her finger, her mind turning over the events of the day with the same deliberate rhythm. It would have been easy to let anger take root, to replay Clara's words and actions with the bitterness they deserved. And yet, Juliet found herself lingering instead on the quieter moments, the young flight attendant's kindness, the passengers who had whispered their discontent about Clara's behavior, the way the atmosphere had shifted when Juliet stood her ground. These were the moments that mattered. The ones that hinted at something larger than her own experience. Outside the window, the sky stretched wide and endless, its pale blues and soft whites blending into a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. It was beautiful, in a way that felt almost unfair. How could the world look so calm, so perfect, when it carried so much weight beneath its surface? Juliet shifted slightly, glancing at Alan. He was still engrossed in his tablet, his face a mask of concentration. For a moment, she considered saying something about Clara, about the way people like her were so often dismissed, reduced to caricatures or stereotypes by those who didn't bother to see them. But she didn't. Alan wasn't a bad man, and his silence earlier hadn't come from malice. It was the silence of someone who didn't know how to help. Someone who had never been forced to understand what it meant to carry the quiet burden Juliet carried every day. Instead, she turned her attention inward, letting her thoughts drift back to Clara. The sharpness in her voice, the way she moved with an almost practiced impatience, these things had grated on Juliet in the moment. But now they seemed different. Clara wasn't just rude or dismissive, she was angry. It was an anger Juliet recognized, though it wore a different face than her own. Where Juliet's anger had always been quiet, restrained, Clara's had spilled over, directed outward at whoever crossed her path. Juliet thought of the conversation she had overheard earlier, the murmurs about Clara's history of snapping at passengers. The picture that formed in her mind wasn't of a cruel or hateful woman, but of someone who was struggling, someone whose own burdens had twisted into something toxic. It didn't excuse Clara's behavior, nothing could, but it made Juliet wonder how much of the day's tension had been about her, and how much had been about Clara's own battles. She sighed softly, folding her hands in her lap. The world was complicated, layered with unspoken struggles that often went unnoticed. Juliet had spent her life navigating those layers, learning when to speak up and when to let things pass. Today, she had chosen to act, not because she wanted to punish Clara, but because she couldn't let the moment define her. There was power in that, she realized, in choosing her response, in reclaiming the dignity Clara had tried to strip away. The new flight attendant approached, her warm smile a welcome contrast to the earlier tension. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked. her tone gentle. No, thank you, Juliet replied, her voice steady. I'm fine. As the attendant moved on, Juliet noticed the way Clara avoided looking in her direction. It wasn't defiance or hostility if anything. It was avoidance. As though Clara couldn't quite face the consequences of her actions. Juliet didn't know what had been said to her. But it was clear that something had changed. Clara moved through the cabin more cautiously now, her sharp edges dulled by some unseen force. Juliet turned her gaze back to the window. The sky was darker now, the sunlight fading into a soft, golden glow. She thought about the people in the cabin, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles. Some, like Clara, wore their frustrations openly. Others, like Juliet, carried them quietly, tucked away where they wouldn't draw attention. There was a kind of symmetry to it, Juliet thought. The plane, with its narrow aisles and shared spaces, was a microcosm of the larger world, a place where lives intersected briefly, revealing glimpses of humanity's complexities. It was messy and imperfect, but it was also full of possibility. As the plane continued its journey, Juliet leaned back in her seat, letting her eyes close for a moment. She didn't have all the answers about Clara, about the world, about the quiet battles that shaped so many lives, but she felt at peace with the choices she had made. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about holding on to the things that made her who she was. Her dignity, her resolve, her humanity. The cabin lights dimmed, and Juliet opened her eyes to the soft glow of evening. The journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time that day, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The cabin settled into the subdued rhythm of mid-flight. The dimmed lights cast a soft glow, and the passengers shifted in their seats, finding small comforts in the shared stillness. Juliet remained seated, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She wasn't entirely calm. The earlier sting of Clara's words still lingered, but she had found a measure of balance, a steadying force that kept her grounded. She watched Clara move through the aisles, her movements precise yet lacking the assuredness she had shown earlier. There was a stiffness to her now, a reluctance in her posture. It was subtle, but Juliet noticed. Clara's aura of control had frayed, leaving her edges exposed. Juliet wondered if the young flight attendant Mia, she'd learned her name, had spoken to her, or if the shift had come from something deeper, something unspoken. As Clara passed Juliet's row, their eyes met briefly. Clara quickly looked away, her lips pressed into a tight line. Juliet didn't flinch. She held the gaze, her expression neutral, but her quiet resolve unmistakable. There was no need for words. The balance of power had shifted. Juliet turned her gaze to the window. The world outside, a dark expanse punctuated by scattered stars. She thought about the dynamics of the cabin, the way authority and perception worked in small, enclosed spaces like this. Clara had wielded her authority carelessly, dismissing Juliet without thought for the impact. But now, that authority was under quiet scrutiny, not just from Juliet but from the passengers who had overheard, from the crew who had intervened. The confrontation wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. Juliet had always believed that the most profound changes happened in the silences, in the spaces where people were forced to reckon with themselves. Clara's discomfort, her reluctance to meet Juliet's eyes, was proof enough that the message had been received. Mia returned to Juliet's row, her presence a stark contrast to Clara's earlier demeanor. "How are you doing?" she asked softly, her kind eyes meeting Juliet's. "I'm fine, thank you," Juliet replied, and she meant it. The earlier humiliation had been sharp, cutting, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was more like a scar, now visible but no longer raw. Mia lingered for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask," she said before moving on. Juliet watched her go, a quiet gratitude settling over her. It wasn't just Mia's actions that mattered, it was her intention. She had listened, acknowledged Juliet's experience, and acted. It wasn't about fixing everything, because some things couldn't be fixed in a single interaction, but about showing that someone cared enough to try. Across the aisle, a man leaned over to his seatmate, whispering something. Juliet caught only fragments. Clara's name, a mention of rudeness, but it was enough to know the murmurs were spreading. The passengers weren't angry, not outwardly, but there was a shared understanding now. A collective awareness that something had been wrong and was being quietly corrected. Juliet shifted slightly in her seat, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. She thought about the broader implications of moments like this. The way small actions rippled outward. Clara's behavior had been unacceptable. But it was also familiar, a reflection of a world where such dismissiveness often went unchecked. Juliet had learned to navigate that world, to pick her battles carefully. But today felt different. Today, she had acted, not with anger, but with quiet determination. As the plane continued its journey, Juliet noticed Clara again. She was standing near the galley, her back to the cabin, her shoulders slightly hunched. She was speaking to another crew member, her gestures restrained, her voice low. Juliet couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Clara wasn't in control anymore. The authority she had wielded so carelessly earlier had been tempered, replaced by something quieter, less certain. Juliet didn't take satisfaction in Clara's discomfort. That wasn't the point. What mattered was the shift. The acknowledgement that Clara's behavior had consequences. Even if they were subtle. Juliet had been seen, her experience validated, and that was enough. The flight settled into its final hours. The cabin growing quieter as passengers began to doze or turn their attention to books and screens. Juliet leaned back, her eyes closing briefly. She wasn't thinking about Clara anymore, or even the incident that had started everything. Her thoughts had moved on to larger things, the quiet resilience it took to navigate a world that didn't always see you clearly. The power of small acts of courage. The way dignity could be reclaimed in the most unexpected moments. When she opened her eyes, the sky outside had begun to lighten. A soft glow on the horizon signaling the coming dawn. The journey wasn't over yet. But Juliet felt ready for whatever came next. She had found her footing. And for the first time that day, she felt entirely steady. The plane cruised steadily through the thinning darkness, the faint glow of dawn inching closer with each passing mile. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was subdued, a collective stillness settling over the passengers. Juliet sat quietly in her seat, her gaze drifting between the window and the faint movements of the crew. The earlier tension had dissipated, but it left behind a lingering awareness. Like the aftertaste of a bitter drink. Clara moved through the cabin with an air of restraint. She still performed her duties, pouring coffee, answering questions, but the confidence that had once marked her every step was absent. Her shoulders seemed tighter, her movements less fluid, as though she were navigating an invisible maze. Juliet watched her from the corner of her eye, noting the subtle shifts. Clara wasn't the same woman who had confronted her in the emergency exit row. Something had changed, and though it wasn't dramatic, it was undeniable. Mia, the young attendant, passed by Juliet's row again. She paused, leaning slightly toward her. "Everything okay?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that felt rare in such settings. "Yes," Juliet replied with a small smile. "Thank you." Mia nodded, lingering for a moment before continuing down the aisle. Her presence was a quiet reminder that compassion could coexist with professionalism. That authority didn't have to come at the expense of humanity. Juliet turned her attention to Clara, who had stopped near the galley to speak with another crew member. Their conversation was low, their gestures subdued but deliberate. Clara's expression was difficult to read, somewhere between frustration and resignation. Juliet wondered what Mia or the captain had said to her. Had it been a warning? A reprimand? Or just a conversation meant to address the situation without further escalation? It didn't really matter, Juliet realized. What mattered was the shift in the dynamic. The acknowledgement that Clara's behavior couldn't continue unchecked. The resolution wasn't about punishment or retribution, it was about accountability. Clara had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions, however subtly, and that alone felt significant. The passengers, too, had noticed the change. Juliet caught glimpses of their reactions, the way they glanced at Clara with a mix of curiosity and caution. The quiet murmurs that had replaced the earlier silence. People were paying attention now, not just to Clara, but to the broader implications of what had unfolded. It was a small ripple in a much larger sea, but it was a ripple nonetheless. As the plane began its descent, Juliet felt a sense of closure settling over her. The incident had left its mark. But it no longer felt like a wound. Instead, it felt like a reminder, a call to remain steady in the face of adversity. To find strength in dignity rather than anger. When the seatbelt sign flicked on, signaling the final stretch of the journey, Juliet adjusted her seatbelt and glanced toward the front of the cabin. Clara was there, standing stiffly by the cockpit door as Mia approached her with quiet words. Clara nodded once, her expression tight, before turning to face the cabin. For a brief moment, her eyes met Juliet's, and in that fleeting exchange, Juliet saw something she hadn't expected. A flicker of uncertainty. Maybe even regret. Juliet didn't hold the gaze for long. She looked away, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing more to be said. The interaction was its own conclusion, a subtle acknowledgement that both women understood something had shifted. Even if it would never be openly discussed. As the plane touched down and began to taxi toward the gate, Juliet felt a quiet satisfaction take root within her. She hadn't raised her voice or demanded restitution. She hadn't needed to. The power of her actions lay in their calm, deliberate nature, in the refusal to let someone else dictate her worth. When the doors opened and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Juliet stood, smoothing her skirt and reaching for her bag. Alan, still silent but attentive, fell into step beside her. As they moved toward the exit, Juliet noticed Clara standing at the door, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding direct contact with the passengers. As Juliet passed, she paused briefly, just long enough for their gazes to meet again. Clara's face remained impassive, but there was no mistaking the tension in her expression. Juliet gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, not one of forgiveness, but of recognition. Clara didn't return it, but she didn't need to. Walking into the terminal, Juliet felt a lightness she hadn't expected. The events of the flight hadn't solved anything. Not in the grand sense. The world remained what it was, complex, flawed, and often unfair. But for a few hours in a pressurized cabin, something had shifted. It wasn't just about Clara or Juliet, it was about the quiet, unseen work of holding people accountable, of refusing to let indignities pass unnoticed. As Juliet and Alan moved toward the baggage claim, the hum of the terminal surrounded them, a reminder that life continued, steady and unrelenting. Juliet adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her steps confident and deliberate. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for now, she felt ready to face it, calm, composed, and resolute. The terminal buzzed with the familiar symphony of an airport announcements crackling over loudspeakers, the rolling hum of suitcases, and the steady murmur of conversations in countless languages. Juliet moved through it all with quiet purpose, her bag slung neatly over her shoulder, her steps deliberate but unhurried. Alan walked beside her, his usual briskness tempered by the weight of the flight they had just left behind. Juliet's thoughts, however, lingered on what had transpired. The confrontation with Clara hadn't been loud or dramatic, yet it had carved a space in Juliet's memory, a reminder of how small moments often held the most significance. Clara's words and actions had hurt, but the response to Juliet's own and that of others had been a quiet reclamation of dignity. It wasn't a triumph in the traditional sense, there was no applause, no grand resolution, and yet, it mattered deeply. She and Alan reached the baggage carousel, joining the cluster of passengers waiting for their belongings. Juliet glanced around, observing the people she had spent the past several hours with. Most looked tired, their expressions fixed on the rotating belt as if willing their luggage to appear. But a few faces stood out, those who had shared knowing glances during the flight. Those who had watched Clara with quiet disapproval. Those who, like Juliet, had been part of the unspoken ripple. One woman, standing a few feet away, caught Juliet's eye. She was older, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her posture straight despite the weariness in her face. The woman gave Juliet a small nod, one that needed no explanation. It wasn't gratitude or sympathy, it was solidarity. A silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Juliet returned the nod, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The carousel began to spin, and Juliet focused on the task at hand. Alan broke the silence first. That flight, it was something else. he said, his voice hesitant, as though he were testing the waters. It was. Juliet replied simply, her tone calm but firm. She didn't elaborate. There was no need. As Alan reached for his suitcase, Juliet's mind drifted back to Clara. She wondered what the rest of Clara's day would look like. Whether she would reflect on what had happened or push it aside like so many others had likely done before. Juliet didn't wish her harm. Nor did she hold on to anger. What she hoped was that the encounter would stay with Clara in some small way, nudging her towards something better. Perhaps it was naive, but Juliet had learned to hold on to such hopes, however faint. Her own bag appeared, its familiar shape sliding onto the carousel. She reached for it, the weight familiar in her hand, grounding her in the moment. As she and Alan made their way toward the exit, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The day had been difficult. Yes, but it had also reaffirmed something she had always known but sometimes struggled to believe, that quiet action, even in the face of indifference, could create change. Not always grand or immediate, but meaningful nonetheless. The sliding doors of the terminal opened, and a rush of cool air greeted her. The world outside was bathed in the soft light of morning, the first hints of a new day casting long shadows across the pavement. Juliet paused for a moment, letting the air fill her lungs. Before stepping forward, Alan hesitated beside her. "You handled that well," he said, almost awkwardly. "Better than I would have." Juliet turned to him, her expression serene. "Sometimes it's not about how loud you are," she said. "Sometimes it's about being steady." He nodded, as if turning her words over in his mind. Together, they moved toward the taxi stand, the city waking up around them. As Juliet slid into the back seat of the taxi, her thoughts drifted again to the flight, to Clara, to the way the smallest of moments could ripple outward. She didn't need to know how it would end. Note for Clara, not for anyone else on that plane. What mattered was the act itself. The decision to meet the moment with grace instead of anger, with strength instead of silence. The taxi pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic. Juliet rested her head against the window, watching the city blur past. The world outside was vast and complicated, filled with its own subtle tensions and quiet triumphs. And yet, in that moment, Juliet felt entirely at peace. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself rest. The day ahead would bring its own challenges, its own stories, but for now, she allowed herself to feel the weight of a quiet victory. The kind that wasn't about winning or losing, but about holding on to who she was. And that, she thought, was enough.